Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Fisk. Who's been here before? Who's new? Yeah. We have a wonderful talk for you tonight about the science of sci-fi. But first, before we kind of get into all that, we're going to do a couple of safety things. So first, we ask that you guys keep your mask over your nose and mouth, just that we can respect Boulder County health guidelines that are going on right now. Also, we have 2 exits in our theater. One is behind most of you, over here. Notice how the sign is next to the door. So if you try to exit, go to the door, not the sign. Same with on this side, our sign, our door, use the door. Outside of these doors are restrooms and drinking fountains. These doors do lock behind you, so if you do leave the show at any time, which is fine, just go all the way back to the ones that you came in the first time. Also, we ask that you guys keep your feet off of these lovely new comfortable seats that we have, and that you keep your phones off so you can put them on silent and all that kind of stuff. It's just for an hour, so it'll be all good. So tonight we have a wonderful talk by Annika Rollock, who is a 4th-year PhD student over in our aerospace engineering department. And she's studying astronaut habitats and how to keep those people alive up there. So she's gonna give us a little science of sci-fi breeze through, and I'll let her tell you more about that in a minute. But first we have to acknowledge John, who is behind the screens today, who's gonna be driving us around. Woo! Awesome, and we'll do the presentation. It'll be about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So if you have a burning question, hang on to it. We will get there. Awesome, and give it up for Annika.
Awesome. Can you all hear me? Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you, Colette. That's a great introduction. As Colette said, my name is Annika, and today I'll be talking to you a little bit about how humans live and work in space. And so I'm a huge sci-fi nerd. I grew up watching different science fiction, reading it, and so I'll be starting by talking to you about some examples from science fiction about how humans live and work in space. And then I'll be going into some real life and talking about how we actually send people up into space. Finally, I'll be closing it out with a little bit of technology transfer. So we're talking about how some technology has made the jump from the big screen to real life, and then some that has been inspired from real life on the big screen. So I want to draw your attention upwards right now to this beautiful view of our planet. This is the International Space Station cupola, and the cupola is basically a big window room on the ISS, and it lets our astronauts have a view of Earth. I think it's one of the prettiest, kind of coolest parts of the station, so wanted to include it in the talk. And before we begin, I want to give a disclaimer. I'll be starting by talking about science fiction stories, and I think in some sci-fi circles, there's a bit of like a street cred if something's super realistic or gritty, and I'm not here to diss on any one science fiction story. I believe that the science fiction realism should serve the story you're trying to tell, and the technology that you include in that story should serve the story. And so I'm not here to say one is inherently better because it's more realistic or inherently worse because it's more on the fiction side. With that, I want to give some examples from science fiction. I'll give you a minute to take in some of the photos. Awesome. So drawing your attention to the front of the dome here, we have the wonderful Tom Hanks in the movie Apollo 13. And you may be thinking, well, she's a fraud. Apollo 13 isn't a science fiction movie. And you're right, it's not a science fiction movie. Apollo 13 is basically a blow-by-blow of the real events that happened in the Apollo 13 mission. And it's very realistic. And I include it in this spectrum, as I call it, as kind of the grounding. It's the realistic side of movies. It's basically, like I said before, a blow-by-blow of the actual events, and there's nothing really made up in that story. But as we move along the spectrum, we have some other movies. You may recognize these screenshots from movies like Gravity here and The Martian with Matt Damon. And these movies are still realistic, they're still gritty, they happen in basically the near future, in a world that looks very similar to our world. The Martian, in particular, here seen next to his rover, is well beloved by engineers and by scientists because of how realistic it is. The technology in the story, it breaks, things go wrong, and these two movies are inherently a story of survival because the technology is close to what we currently do in space. And so, like I said before, the technology serves the story by allowing our astronauts to get into peril and then try to get themselves out of it. Moving deeper into the fiction side of things, we have movies like Alien and Interstellar. And while there's still some very realistic parts of these movies, they take place in the farther future from our current day. There are more science fiction elements like the alien in Alien and the black hole in Interstellar, because we haven't actually flown into a black hole yet, which is kind of unfortunate. But these movies use this technology to tell the story of survival in trying to find a new home for humanity in the case of Interstellar, and to survive against the aliens in Alien. And finally, as we get farther and farther from the present into the future, we get to shows like Star Trek. And now Star Trek, the technology really takes a back seat. It's kind of there for show, but we have things like the warp drive, we have things like replicators, and the technology isn't the centerpiece of the film, because the centerpiece is more so humanity as we go out and we meet strange new species, strange new worlds, and the focus of the story is how humanity behaves when we are in those new scenarios. And I'll be going into greater detail into Star Trek and some other stories up next. And finally, you may recognize this image here from Star Wars. And I might get some hate for this, but I think Star Wars isn't really science fiction, because my 2 cents is that the technology in Star Wars is kind of just like trappings. It's just like decoration. It's really more a story of fantasy, a story from a galaxy far, far away. But really, it's a story of space wizards, and it's an awesome story. But the technology doesn't really necessarily need to be explained, need to be realistic for us to enjoy Star Wars. So I've gone through this spectrum of different movies, and I want to highlight 3 in particular. Star Trek, like I said, which takes place in the far future. This movie here, which is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which takes place in kind of the mid-future point. And The Martian, which takes place in what I'll call the near future, close future, present, very close to what we currently would do on Mars. And so we'll start with the show Star Trek. You may recognize the scene before you. It is the bridge from Star Trek: The Next Generation. And it looks very different than our current spacecraft. It's kind of similar to just a normal room. And just to set the scene for you, when Star Trek was created, it was the 1960s. The Cold War was ramping up. JFK had just made his speech to put a man on the moon by the time the decade was out. And we had really only been to space in short hops. The Gemini program was well underway, and we were sending people up, at least the US was, 2 at a time. And Star Trek premiered on NBC in 1966. Now, Gene Roddenberry was the creator of Star Trek, and he was a military man. Gene had not actually been to space, but he had served in the US military. So you may notice that a lot of if you've seen Star Trek, the ranks and the mannerisms and a lot of the life on board the starships resembles that in the US Navy. Things beep like radar would on a US naval vessel, and a lot of the rankings are very similar, the insignia. And so he really made life resemble what he knew. The technology, likewise, it really takes a back seat to the story. It serves to make life as close to normal on board the starships. We have gravity. We don't really ever find out what's causing that artificial gravity, but we also don't really care, because the story lies in how humans get into trouble, meet new species, and then get out of that trouble. Up next, I want to talk about a movie that also came out in the 1960s. Hopefully you recognize some of these scenes from the great 2001: A Space Odyssey, but if you don't, definitely go watch that movie. It still holds up today. Now, this movie was written in the 1960s through a collaboration between Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick. Now, you may know the name Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke was a famous science fiction author, and Stanley Kubrick was a famous director. And if you know anything about Stanley Kubrick, you may know that he was a perfectionist. And he was very stressed out making this movie. He was stressed because NASA was just working away like busy bees trying to get to the moon. And his worst fear was that NASA was going to outpace his movie. He was afraid that we were going to get to the moon, then just go straight to Mars and make his movie look terrible because he didn't dream big enough in the movie. So what did Stanley do? Stanley found some aerospace engineers, and he brought them onto his movie set. And he said, make this as realistic as possible. So when you see the control panels in the movie, those were actually control panels made by aerospace engineers. He brought them on to do a lot of the set design, the prop design, and I believe it actually paid off. I want to draw your attention to the slight right in the dome here, which is the space station in the movie. And the space station is very similar to early concept designs that came out of NASA for a spinning space station. And in this particular example, the artificial gravity on board the station, which we then see inside the Hilton Hotel that floats high above Earth, is explained. We get to see that cool technology aspect of how we came to have artificial gravity inside the space station. Likewise, the spacesuit here is a pressure suit. It actually looks very similar to the pressure suit that would later be worn by space shuttle astronauts on launch and reentry. Coincidence? I don't think so. I think that someone at NASA had a say and was a huge nerd, so we thank them. I want to also draw your attention over to the right here to the spacecraft Discovery. In the movie, that is the spacecraft the astronauts take to Jupiter, and Stanley wanted to make that as realistic as possible also. And so the astronauts have to deal with things like a time delay when they talk to Earth, and that is reflective of the actual time delay from the speed of light between Earth and Jupiter, and they have to wait for a response. And you may also notice, sorry to make you swivel your heads around here, the evil computer HAL on the left. HAL 9000 was the evil AI on board the spacecraft Discovery. And when Kubrick was coming up with his evil computer-y villain, he went to IBM and said, show me the best computer you have. And they showed him a giant room full of the one computer they had that took up a huge wing of their building, full of air conditioning, because this was the 1960s. And he said, that's not very, doesn't look very visually appealing. And they were like, well, we're trying to work on it. And so Stanley Kubrick wanted to make something that would be small, that would be very evil looking, and that would fit on board a spacecraft. And so HAL 9000 is basically an evil Siri, or an evil Alexa, and he was very forward-thinking. And so it honestly has aged quite well in terms of the technology on board that spacecraft. And I guess my fun fact is that NASA's actually working on AI, kind of like HAL, for our deep space efforts. Hopefully, we don't make an evil one. And finally, I want to talk about a bit of a darling in the aerospace community, which is The Martian. Now, The Martian was not made in the 1960s. It was made recently. The author of the book that the movie is based on is named Andy Weir. And Andy was a computer scientist. He wrote the book. It was his first novel. And the movie was made in, I believe, 2016, but in the 2010s. So it is very recent. And when Andy Weir was writing the novel, he found some engineering friends and some aerospace engineering friends. And so, like Kubrick, he brought some people in, basically sent them emails, and tried to make his story as realistic as possible. I've included some of these screenshots from the movie to highlight some of what I find most interesting in the movie and kind of some things that have made the jump and look really good. So I wanted to bring your attention to the far right, which is Mark Watney's spacesuit. Now, the spacesuit he's wearing is a lot more streamlined than the ones we currently have for astronauts, but it has some few notable features that I find that work really well, which are the knee pads, because astronauts that we would send to Mars would basically be geologists. They're going to be spending a lot of their time on their knees, a lot of time digging, and a lot of time just trying to look at rocks. So knee pads are actually very important. Similarly, the lights on his helmet are equally important to be able to see through some of the dust and see in the darkness once the sun sets on Mars. Moving left, the rover here has 6 wheels. If you've ever seen some of the more recent rovers that have gone to Mars, you may notice they also have 6 wheels. And this is to adapt to some of the really rocky terrain on the Martian surface. 6 wheels do a little bit better in terms of point of contact on the surface than 4 wheels. And so that is a direct inspiration from the current rovers we have on the surface. If you've seen the movie, you may know the infamous potato scene where he's trying to grow potatoes to keep himself alive on the surface of Mars. And currently, NASA is working on growing a lot of vegetables because when you're living in space, you can only eat freeze-dried food for so long before A, it gets very boring, and B, you start to get things like scurvy and a lack of nutrients. And so I'll talk a little bit later about the ongoing efforts in NASA to grow produce in space. And finally, this may not look like much, but one of my favorite details from the movie is the shape of the habitat. Now, it's a big cylinder here, and if you've ever seen a rocket, you may notice that it is also a large cylinder. And when you're trying to launch something very big, you want to maximize the amount of volume you have inside the habitat, and so it has to be a big cylinder. Small detail, but I just think it's nice that someone in Hollywood pays attention to real-life physics, so sits well with engineers. Awesome, so I should have mentioned this at the start of the show, but I do have some audience engagement questions. And so I'll be asking a question. I want you guys to just shout out the answer. Doesn't have to be right, but would love some engagement. And so I've talked a little bit about how humans live and work in space, in science fiction. And I want to give you a thought experiment about what it would take to actually keep someone alive in space. So this is our astronaut, Buddy the astronaut. And let's pretend that we've launched him into space. He's now successfully floating in the harsh vacuum of space. But we want to keep Buddy alive. So what are the things that we need to give Buddy to keep him alive? My hint is that we're all breathing it here in this room. Yeah, air, yeah. So the number one thing we have to do is get that vacuum away from Buddy, because the vacuum of space is not what humans have evolved to survive in. And so it'll do some pretty nasty things. It'll freeze your skin, it'll make some liquids boil off of your tongue and your eyes. So we have to give Buddy a box full of air. So let's pretend that we've given him a box. Let's call it 1 atmosphere, sea level air. So that's 20% oxygen, roughly, 80% nitrogen, very rough. So Buddy is sitting in his air box. What starts to happen after a little bit? Yeah, so people shouted out a few different things, but it's all right. He will start to use up the oxygen that we have given him. And so we need to make sure we're adding oxygen back into the box. And someone also mentioned CO2, carbon dioxide. That is what we all breathe out. That'll start to accumulate around Buddy's head, which is very not good. And in space, we don't have gravity as strongly as we do on Earth. And so here on Earth, when you breathe out and you breathe in, all of that air mixes, and it all does a very good job of keeping that carbon dioxide away from your head. In space, that doesn't happen. So we got to add a bunch of fans. So we got a bunch of fans going, got to put oxygen back in, got to take that carbon dioxide out of the air, got to mix it all around. Awesome. So we've kept him alive for more than, a few minutes. What else do you breathe out? Moisture, yes. Moisture is enough to be a problem in space. You may notice when it's a very cold day and you're breathing out, you start to see a little fog of moisture come out. Well, that's going to start to also accumulate in the air around Buddy's head and can cause you to drown in the air. So we need to take that moisture out of the box. We also need to keep it at a sufficiently moist enough point so that he's not super dry. So we call that a shirt sleeves environment. And that is an environment that is comfortable enough to be existing in your, khakis and polo shirt or whatever astronauts like to wear. Awesome. So we've kept Buddy alive. We got some air going, got that moisture coming out. There's also other dangers in space that we have to make sure we're designing for. These include things like radiation from the sun and the horrors of space debris. So in space, the radiation from the sun isn't immediately harmful, but it will start to cause problems after a long time of exposure. Space debris is pretty immediately harmful. When things are flying around in orbit, they're going in excess of 36,000 miles an hour if they're coming in close. And this is all of the space debris that we have currently above the Earth. And so space is big, but when you're flying in this, it looks kind of small. And this debris is anything from paint chips to parts of solar panels that have gotten ripped off, to old satellites that no longer work or just have gone dead. And so we need to make sure we're tracking this and we know exactly where things are so that our astronauts are safe. The International Space Station had to move a total, I think, of 4 times last year, which may not seem like much, but when you're on board and NASA calls and they say, hey, you got something the size of a penny coming at you, but it's going 36,000 miles an hour, you want to get out of the way. And it's a pretty stressful time to be on board the space station. So we got to watch out for that. And that's just the immediate dangers in space. Yeah, so here are some pictures that I want to talk about the long-term effects of living in space. We'll start on the right here, which actually is not a picture of someone in space. It is a picture of someone coming back from space. And when you come back from space, a few things happen. You have been deconditioned in your muscles because you don't have to work as hard. So you're a little wobbly, and you're not going to walk right away. And your inner ear starts to go a little funky. And that's because your inner ear is our one sense of balance in space. And your inner ear likes to have gravity to tell it which way is down. Well, in space, we don't have gravity telling us which way is down. And so when astronauts first launch to space, they spend a few hours being very, very motion sick. They'll often feel and report feelings of being dizzy, of tumbling, no matter how many hours they spent flying their jets or being inside a centrifuge. And so astronauts will be wobbly both upon launch and re-entry from space. To combat all of that deconditioning, both from the heart not having to work as hard to pump blood up from the bottom of the body, and from the muscles not having to support you walking around, astronauts work out a lot. And they do a lot of cardiovascular workouts, as you can see here. Someone's on a treadmill. Someone actually ran the Boston Marathon in space, which I think is really cool. It's a long time to be in a bungee cord running, but they did it. So there's also on board, there's a bike and an ergometer for different types of workouts. Astronauts also try to do as much loading as possible on their body to try to simulate gravity in some ways. And so they'll do a lot of weightlifting. And this is to keep the bone density up, because your bone density also starts to drop off after a long time in space. And finally, I want to bring your attention to this image here, which is actually that's the cupola, which we saw earlier in this talk, and the astronaut floating inside. And that's kind of like a fetal position. And in space, the ergonomic position that you work at is not the same as it is on Earth. On Earth, a good, healthy working position is kind of, straight back, arms in front of you, working at your computer or at your desk. In space, that doesn't really matter. You no longer have the same loading on your spine, and so the most comfortable ergonomic position becomes one of a floating fetal position. So when NASA designs workstations in space, they often design them so that astronauts can float with their backs kind of curved and bend their legs kind of over a keyboard. And so a lot of your normal tasks are ergonomically designed differently in space. So I put these images up to start you thinking about how much space we give our astronauts in space. Now, hopefully, maybe some of you have been camping before, and you know that a tent is okay, it's fine for a few days, but it depends on how many people you put in that tent and how long you're planning on staying in that tent. Imagine going camping for 2 days with your best friend. No problem, totally fine. Now imagine going camping for 4 weeks with 3 strangers, and imagine you can't leave the tent. That's definitely not a lot of space, right? A lot of us spent more time at home this past year and a half than we may have done in the past, and a lot of us spent that time in apartments. And now I know I did. And apartments seem like a pretty good amount of space when you first tour them and then sign a lease. But when you're living in that apartment and you're trying to work in that apartment and you're trying to work out and relax in that apartment, that space starts to feel a lot smaller. So what I'm getting at is the considerations when you're trying to design living spaces in space are basically the number of people and then how long you're going for. Because that's going to determine what amount of space is comfortable for what you're trying to accomplish. And I've included a picture of a house as well. We're not quite at the point where we're launching houses into space, but the house would be the ideal, right? Because you can separate out your work, you're working out, you're relaxing, you're eating, all for the different parts of your day. And you can also get away from people in case you had, a fight, or maybe you just don't want to see people for a little bit. You can actually get your own personal space. And so we're not at the point where we're launching houses into space, but I want to talk a little bit about the history of space travel and show you just how far we've come in terms of the things that we launch and how we put people into space. So hopefully you recognize some of these capsules. On the left here, we have the Mercury capsule, which there's a replica, I just realized, just outside these doors, which you can go check out after the show. And the Mercury capsule was what the US used to send the first astronauts, American astronauts, into space. And they would go one at a time, and they would only really go up for about a day or less. And the space was quite crowded, but it was kind of a test bed to see if people could survive launch, re-entry, zero gravity, and do basic tasks and keep their body functioning for short periods of time. Gemini was the second phase of NASA's journey to the moon, and it sent 2 people into space using this capsule. Now, my comparison for Gemini is, imagine going on a road trip, but just having the front 2 seats of a car. And that's about the amount of space that the Gemini astronauts had. Which may seem okay, right? But you can't leave the car, and you're sleeping, eating, trying to do experiments, changing, going to the bathroom, trying to just live your life in the front seat of a car with someone that you hopefully like. And the longest Gemini mission was 13 days, which is a long time to be in the front seat of a car. I also want to talk a little bit here about the demographic of astronauts, because the demographic in the 1960s of the astronaut corps was basically all test pilots. It was people from the US military. And these tended to be white men, and usually approaching middle age. And when engineers were designing for these people, they were a little bit callous. They thought they could be, spam in a can, is what they called them, because they were tough. They were test pilots. They could survive anything. When we were sending people to space for a week, 2 weeks at a time, you can definitely withstand tougher conditions. But people are people, right? People are fundamentally human. And so when we push towards living for longer periods of time in space, we really need to think about things like mental health and other factors, including work performance. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the final mission phase of the Apollo program, which was the Apollo missions. And these were a little bit different from the earlier 2 because they no longer included just a capsule. They had 2 spacecraft components, the command module and then the lunar lander. Here I've showed the lunar lander and an astronaut coming out of it. And the lunar lander was interesting because it had astronauts living on the surface of the moon. So we've reintroduced gravity, however weak. And so astronauts couldn't just float around and sleep in their chair. They actually slept in hammocks. So when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were on the surface of the moon, they slept in hammocks crisscrossed over each other because there wasn't enough space to hang them side by side. I've stood in a mock-up of the Apollo lander, and I've tried to lay down diagonally across it. And I'm 5'5", but I couldn't stretch out all the way. So you can definitely imagine it being a kind of a tight squeeze, even with the hammock. When Neil Armstrong piloted the lunar lander down to the surface, he also didn't have a chair, because when you go to space, mass is money. It costs a lot of money to launch things into space. And so the heavier something is, the harder it is to launch it. And so they couldn't quite include a chair for Neil, and so he had to pilot the lander standing up to the surface and then back up to rendezvous with the command module. So that was the 1960s through the 70s. But as we improved our technology, we introduced a new age of spaceflight, and that was the space shuttle. The space shuttle is shown here docked to the Russian space station Mir. And the space shuttle, you may realize, looks a little bit different from a capsule. It actually launched like a rocket, landed like a plane. It was the first reusable launch vehicle. And it opened up the doors and really increased the it opened up the doors so that more people could fly in space. We were able to launch not just test pilots, but people who were chemists, who were biologists, who were doctors. And so with that, we were able to launch hundreds of more people into space on different missions and actually do science in space, real science beyond just training our test pilots to do some basic chemistry in Gemini. And shuttle was different because it had people on a schedule that was much closer to what they would be doing in a lab or doing in experiments. When they were sleeping, initially, the shuttle astronauts would sleep in sleeping bags that were basically just cocoons velcroed to the wall. And they would float on into the sleeping bag, and they would strap their arms down if they wanted, because it's a little bit creepy to wake up with your arms floating around you. But they would do this because it's kind of disconcerting to wake up floating around somewhere randomly in the shuttle away from where you went to sleep. But they didn't have much personal space, as you can see. And all of their belongings, all their personal effects, had to be stowed in basically the wall of the space shuttle. Later on, astronauts got bunk beds. And a lot of astronauts have spoken candidly about how much of an improvement this was in terms of mental health, just to be able to have your own personal space. You could close off the bunk beds here, go to sleep, put your personal items inside the storage containers there, and you could actually get some peace and quiet. I also want to highlight Kalpana Chawla here. She was the first astronaut of Indian origin, and she actually was a CU graduate, so I'd like to bring her up when I can. So Space Shuttle did a lot for us. It flew for over 30 years and brought a lot of new people into space. It did a lot of really good science. And it also was the key to building the next phase of human spaceflight. That's pretty cool, right? That's the International Space Station. Now, the International Space Station, you may have figured out by the name, is an international effort. It was made by over 20 countries coming together and launching the first module, Unity, into space in 1998. Now, my question for you, for the audience, is when was the last time all the humans were on Earth at the same time? Was it 6 months ago? 2 years ago? Last week? A little louder? 2001? You're actually really close. It was 2000. So people have been living continuously in space for over 20 years now. I just think it's kind of wild that there haven't been all of the humans in the same space since 2000. And so the International Space Station brought in this new era of people working in space continuously, expedition by expedition. And because of that, we had to make ISS more of a home. I want to bring your attention to the middle picture here, because I talked a lot about sleeping arrangements. And the sleeping arrangements on ISS look a little bit different than both Shuttle and Apollo did. They have actual crew quarters, which, granted, are a little bit bigger than a phone booth. But still, they are a private space for the crew to come and sleep. You see their bed there on the wall, or the floor, or the ceiling. It doesn't really matter in space. And you see their personal computers that they can use for work, to call home, to write emails, etc. And this is really important, not only for the crew's mental health, but also for their sleep quality, because the ISS is a national lab. It is like NCAR down the road, in that the science that goes on there is all public knowledge. It's also very loud. The ISS vibrates, it beeps, the lights are pretty harsh. And so we need to give our astronauts peace of mind and the ability to feel as comfortable as possible when they're there for 6 months, 8 months, a year. I talked a lot about food and how bad it is. And one complaint that astronauts had earlier on in space travel in the ISS was how bad the coffee was. And so this is an Italian astronaut, and a few years ago they launched the ISS espresso machine. They were able to give the astronauts actual fresh coffee in space, And this was a huge boom in productivity, as you can imagine. So the food is actually so bad in space that one of the side effects when you go to space is actually weight loss, and that's just because the food tastes terrible. And so trying to get fresh ingredients to our astronauts and to get them actual nutrients is one of the most important things. Here we have astronaut Scott Kelly looking absolutely delighted by some lemons. And this is a fresh delivery of produce to the ISS because the food that we send up that has the longest shelf life, again, is not the food that tastes the best. And so fresh produce will not only prevent things like scurvy, but they'll actually make the living arrangements a lot better and make the astronauts happy. So gotta send that produce. I wanna draw your attention over to the right now because the astronauts work a pretty tight schedule. They tend to work 10 to 12-hour days most days and spend a lot of their free time fixing things that have gone wrong on the ISS. But they do try to relax whenever they can. They'll do things like costume contests, and they had a great inter-country Olympic event last year with the Olympics. Definitely would encourage you all to look up the videos of the ISS Olympics. It included synchronized floating and some really fun games of, I think it was like space hockey. I know I love to watch Netflix and TV, and astronauts do too. We now have the ability to beam up and give the astronauts movies, shows, the latest on TV. And so they'll spend a lot of time together watching movies in their free time to relax. And so really ISS has tried to become as close to a home as we can make it. So I've talked a little bit about science fiction and how humans live and work in space through history and how they currently do it. And I want to highlight some specific technology and its direct inspiration from real life. I mentioned earlier the potatoes in The Martian, being inspired by real-life efforts at NASA to grow produce. And this is Project Veggie. Veggie is an acronym that I'm not going to pretend to know what it stands for. And it is a project to grow produce on board the ISS. A few years ago, they had their first successful lettuce crop. And I think recently they had their first salsa for space tacos. So Veggie is going strong. You also notice that they are growing nope, you're good. They're using a UV light because they don't have windows on board the ISS except for that cupola that I showed you earlier. And unfortunately, we can't put everything in the cupola, and astronauts want to use it to look down. And so we have to grow our produce with UV lights. There's also a sunrise and sunset every 90 minutes, and so the plants would get very confused. So this is from a movie we didn't talk too much about, but the black hole pictured here is from the movie Interstellar. Now, Interstellar, like a lot of the movies we talked about, brought in some engineers and some scientists to help make the movie. In this case, it was physicists to use equations to model the black hole that you may have seen in the movie. And I was shocked because a few years ago, we got the first picture back of an actual black hole. And it's a little blurry, but I think if you were to sharpen up this image, it would look identical to the one in the movie. And so science is right. And I think this is one of the coolest things ever, that we basically proved our equations right by imaging the first black hole. Up next, I want to highlight some examples from my favorite TV show, Star Trek. If you're about my age, your first cell phone may have been a flip phone, kind of like the Motorola Razr, and the communicators from Star Trek look a lot like those flip phones. Now, I want to remind you that Star Trek was written and first filmed in the 1960s, when phones were still firmly attached to walls and computers still used punch cards. So the fact that the creators and the writers of Star Trek envisioned a communicating device that was handheld and flipped open, I find was quite astounding. Likewise, in Star Trek, when the bridge is communicating with someone else on a different ship, they bring up their image on the view screen in front of the bridge. And they talk kind of like we've been talking to people over Zoom and Skype for a year now. And so again, I really think the writers and the director of Star Trek were just kind of truly visionary in thinking about the future. And finally, the pads that the Star Trek officers bring from room to room are really similar to an iPad. They're able to bring a lot of information in from the ship's computer. They're able to take notes and send messages and look up information. And so sometimes real life is directly inspired from the science fiction that have inspired people when they were young or just are nerdy about, and I think that's super cool. I've talked a lot about technology, but I also want to talk about the human factor, because people may be inspired as engineers to make products that are inspired by science fiction, but it does more than that. And so the actress on the right here is Nichelle Nichols. She played Uhura on the original Star Trek. And again, Star Trek was filmed in the 1960s as the civil rights movement was first ramping up. And Nichelle Nichols wanted to leave the show. It was actually Martin Luther King Jr. who convinced her to stay, because she played a role that was very different from the way a lot of Black women were shown on TV at the time. She was an active officer on the bridge. She was not a background character. She was not a maid. She actually had a real role, a real character. And he convinced her to stay because she was a role model for so many people. This is astronaut Mae Jemison. She was a shuttle astronaut, and she was directly inspired by Nichelle Nichols' role on Star Trek. Mae Jemison is a phenomenal woman. She's fantastic. She also would later go on to guest star on Star Trek Next Generation, so she brought it full circle. But I want to include this to remind you that the stories that we tell on the screen are more than just stories. They do actually inspire real-life people, and they inspire us to make the world a better place. And so I've given you some examples of science fiction, of how humans live and work in space through movies and TV. I've talked a little bit about how they actually do it in real life, and shown some of the technology that has made the jump from the big screen to real life. Now I want to give you a few takeaways. I mentioned earlier that in science fiction, the technology should serve the story. In real life, when we design missions, the technology serves the mission. It helps us accomplish some sort of goal. But in the end, I think that science fiction, stories, and real space travel actually aren't that different. In science fiction, the technology is used to hold a mirror up to humanity and makes us ask questions about who we are. And so when we go to space, when we send people to space, when humanity reaches out beyond our home planet, what stories are we bringing out with us? Thank you so much for coming to my talk, and I'll now answer some questions.
We'll give Annika a second to rest her voice there. But does anyone have any questions for our speaker? Oh, I saw your hand go up right away. I lied, and you're not going to get a break. Sorry.
How often do the astronauts actually get fresh produce? Is it like an everyday thing, or is it a special treat?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, so the resupply varies depending on things like launch schedules and weather. But usually it's like once a month, about maybe a little bit less. So it really is not like a regular trip to a grocery store. And so that's why we're trying to look into growing vegetables on board the ISS and things like that, to keep astronauts healthy. Yeah.
I have two questions. Just as I already told that there are a lot of debris already in the Earth's orbit, so and every year every country launches something. So it can be something like we need to clean that. Maybe. And second question is like NASA is I think thinking of sending people in Mars.
Mm-hmm.
It will take I think 4 to 6 months in the space. So what kind of difficulties they will have spending 6 to 6 months like that with a journey which is maybe uncertain.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the first time.
Yeah, so first question, space debris. It's a really tough question. That's because a lot of countries are launching things into space, and countries are really bad at agreeing on things, and so we have a bit of a tragedy of the commons in space. Imagine that you're trying to all take care of a park, and your neighbors don't want to follow the same rules as you. So that's part of the issue of the space debris right now. We're trying to instate things like things need to come out of orbit within 25 years. That's a really long time, because we send a lot of stuff up in 25 years. There are certain companies that are looking at removing debris from space. The thing is that no one's really paying for that yet. And so the tough thing is trying to get that to be an actual incentive before it becomes like WALL-E when there's like a bunch of junk floating around. So it's a tough question. No one has the answer yet, and it's currently being worked on. Your second question was about going to Mars. The challenges of Mars are a lot. The main one is that astronauts will be floating for a long time in space. And right now, when astronauts come back after about 6 months, they're really shaky, like I mentioned. And when you land on Mars, you're gonna have to like put up your house. You're gonna have to establish your habitat to move things around. And so making sure that they're physically able to do that is actually a huge problem right now, as well as just protecting them from the radiation in between the planets, because that's not, again, like not a problem immediately, but will be a problem 20 years down the road. Yeah.
I think there's one over here, then I'll come to you.
Perfect address. What inspired you to pursue this career you're undertaking?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I should have mentioned this earlier, but Apollo 13 was a movie I used to watch a lot with my grandmother growing up. And I think that was maybe the beginning of it. I have family in the airlines. My mom's a flight attendant, and my dad was an RCAF pilot. So, or my grandpa was, sorry. And so I had kind of like this like tangential family interest in planes, and then I realized space was even cooler, and so, yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions actually. First one would be, I see on the FISC website it was mentioned that you had a creative writing minor as an aeroastro student at MIT. How did it help you to pursue your career? And the second question is, recently there was an announcement by a consortium of Blue Origin, Sierra Space, Boeing, called Orbital Reef, which is an ISS version of a private entity. How do you think that will help to expedite research in bioastronautics or human factors? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. So first question is difficult. I did minor in creative writing. I do write a lot. I don't know if it's helped me directly in my career beyond. I think it has. I think telling a story is important, and I think engineers often overlook the ability to tell a story, to sell something. I say that like it's kind of callous, like to sell something, but really to convince people why you want to go somewhere, why you want to do something. And I think spaceflight is something that is so fundamentally a human story that you really want to like drive that home, right? Like we're doing this because of humanity. We're not just doing it for giggles to go up into space. We're trying to make Earth a better place, and we're trying to explore our universe. There's lots of stories there, and I think that's really important to be able to tell those stories. Second question was about a recent commercial endeavor by some companies to make a commercial space habitat in low Earth orbit called Orbital Reef. And I think that's awesome. I think whenever commercial companies get interested in space, good things happen, like SpaceX, because now we are able to actually return astronauts from American launch vehicles to the ISS, which is super great because of SpaceX. And I hope the same thing happens for habitats in LEO. We'll have a lot more people flying in space. The cost to entry will go down. I still think it is a billionaire's game, and I hope to one day see it become not a billionaire's game to go to space.
I think we have time for one or two more, if anyone has anything. This side of the room? Yeah. I don't want to bully anyone, but.
Thanks, Annika. You had mentioned HAL 9000, an example of an evil AI, but HAL was a product of human programming and was developed by engineers. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the considerations or implications maybe when you're designing smart systems for habitats and how engineers can make them work for the humans.
This feels like a question you're going to ask in my defense, aren't it? Yeah, so some of the considerations with AI are, if some people don't know what AI it is basically a fancy algorithm that takes in data and it learns something and then it applies that rule to something else. And so I think some of the biggest considerations for things like that is what data you're giving it, because you can reinforce biases, you can reinforce basically garbage by sending it garbage data. And so trying to avoid that is really, really important, and making sure that you're considering all different scenarios when you're trying to teach something like an algorithm from data. Make sure you're giving it good behavior. Yeah, that's probably my short answer for you.
And then last question. Yes, I guess.
So, what's your favorite tidbit that you learned about astronauts in space? Something that blows your mind?
Oh, what's my favorite tidbit of astronauts in space that blows my mind? I guess my favorite like funny tidbit is if you read like Michael Collins is one of my favorite astronauts. He was the third guy in the Apollo 11. So when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin went to the surface of the moon, the third guy, Michael Collins, was in orbit around the moon, waiting for them to come back. And he has a great memoir. And in Carrying the Fire, he talks about trying to learn about rocks and how much he hated his rock class. And so I just love this idea of all these pilots trying to learn about rocks and geology and just none of them paying attention and then going to the moon and then not being able to know what rocks were, which rock was which. So, yeah, that's why I brought space rocks back.
Awesome. So can we give a hand for Annika one more time?